Yeah.
So how many tickets you get?
Yeah.
Exactly. Because you know how last week she said.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's seminar. It is indeed an honor for us, for Ari and the faculty, to have as visitor for over, I think it's 2 weeks period, for Professor Wolf Harness and his wife, Professor Helena Wolf, to be visiting the institute and the faculty at the same time. In the next couple of weeks, they will be put to serious work of giving altogether 4 seminars and workshops with us, an occasion not to be missed, particularly by our PhD students in the faculty. This afternoon, as the first of 4 events, is the seminar by Professor Wolf Harness. For those of us who work in urban studies and cultural studies, we would have had in the past several years, almost a decade, have read Wolf Harness' work. But let me at least introduce him to those who are not as familiar with his material. Professor Harness is Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology at Stockholm University. He is also a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Science, and an honorary fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland. In 2006, he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the Faculty of Social Science at University of Oslo. His research focus, as most of you would know, is on urban societies, media cultures, transnational processes, particularly globalization and cosmopolitanism. The title of the seminar this afternoon, Writing and Reading World Futures, Global Scenarios as Text and Transnational Cultural Phenomena.
Fine, thank you. I think you can all hear me now. No protests, at least. It's a great pleasure to be in Singapore. It's not the first time, although it is the first time at the National University, and I have quite looked forward to this visit and have certainly started enjoying it already. You can see the title there. Let me start out from my corner of the world and tell you about a Swedish compatriot of mine. Over 300 years ago, Olof Rudbeck the Elder published a book which for a while became reasonably well known in his home country as well as abroad. And that is Olof Rudbeck the Elder, and that's the title page of his famous book, The Atlantica, which was published in Swedish and Latin editions, and it purported to demonstrate with a wealth of learning, most genuine and spurious, that world history was in large part Swedish history. Rudbeck was, by the standards of his time and place, an impressive polymath. He was a professor of medicine, an expert botanist, and an astronomer, lectured on a variety of other subjects as well, and had been a youthful and activist rector of his institution, the University of Uppsala. Although he made some enemies along the way, he also had friends at the royal court. 1648, the year when Rudbeck had arrived at Uppsala as a student in his late teens, was the year of the Westphalian Peace. which ended 30 years of war in Europe, led the foundations of a durable continental nation-state order, and also confirmed Sweden, successfully in the war, as a significant power, something a bit like an empire, surrounding much of the Baltic Sea and briefly extending overseas into West Africa, the Gold Coast, and North America, Delaware as well. A country like that could use a certain amount of historical glory, and Rudbeck's intellectual preoccupation somehow came to develop in a direction where he could provide it. He wasn't alone at the time, of course, in trying to determine the location of the vanished kingdom of Atlantis, as once described by Plato. According to his findings, however, the site of Atlantis had actually been just north of Uppsala, at a known ancient cult place. And as his materials just grew and grew, it became clear that Sweden had been settled early by the biblical Noah's son, Japhet, and his descendants, that by way of later southward cultural influences, heathen Nordic deities had been transformed into members of the antique Greek pantheon, and that the Greek and Latin alphabets had developed out of the ancient runes, the script still available for inspection on the rune stones spread in the Swedish terrain. By way of the rivers and the seas, Swedes had reached the Indus River in the east, and America long before anybody else. Moreover, Buddha was a Swede. Now, assembling all the evidence for this view of the past naturally took some time, and Rudbeck was also continuously distracted by administrative problems at his university, so it wasn't until 1679 that the first edition of the Atlantica would be published. It was received respectfully by scholars here and there in Europe, but by that time the career of his country on the more contemporary map was already turning rather topsy-turvy. Then between the early 18th and early 19th centuries, all its more distant territories were lost. The interest in a northerly version of the Atlantis story dwindled, and Sweden could move on to becoming the small, reasonably clean and well-lit place that it has been ever since. Now, what's made me think again about Rudbeck and his work is that the Atlantica is an example of how worlds can be made in texts, a kind of activity which has come to new prominence in more recent times. There are at least two central questions that we can raise about Rudbeck's enterprise. One of them has to do with time, how his project related to the past, the present, and the future. The other is where his Atlantic story places itself on an axis between fact and fiction. Rudbeck certainly placed his Atlantis in the past, but one might sense that his interest was not purely antiquarian. He had an interest in his country's present and future. As anthropologists have long known, myth can become charter. Starting from a few steps back into a past can be the way to speak authoritatively about what is and what is to come. That insight goes back to Bronislaw Malinowski, but one could also quote another writer who was more or less Malinowski's contemporary. And so I quote here, "Who controls the past, controls the future. Who controls the present, controls the past." This is out of George Orwell's novel, 1984, which happens to be another book relevant to our concerns here. When it appeared, Orwell's book was partly about the management of the past, but above all, it was about the future. Then as a novel, 1984 is certainly fiction, but it has sometimes been read as a portrayal of a threatening real future, as a sort of non-fiction in the making. Both Orwell's and Rudbeck's books then actually have fairly complex relationships to time. and with regard to their positioning between fact and fiction. In a way, they may have seemed to move in opposite directions. Orwell's fiction, it was feared, could become a fact. It is perhaps not entirely obvious what may have been the 17th century tongue-in-cheek in Rubek's composition of the Atlantis, but the work was hardly intended at the time to be entirely understood as fiction. Yet, for the 21st century reader, it can hardly be anything else. But again, what had made me think again about writings such as Rubek's and Orwell's are a number of more recent texts which have drawn my continuous interest for some time, other texts in which worlds are made. These are rather further over to the side of non-fiction than Rubek and Orwell, although in a sense not without elements of fiction either. The beginning of this interest can probably be linked to that day in 1993, when in one of the American news weeklies I came across a story on a new old view of the world that was attracting notice. Samuel Huntington, well-known Harvard University professor of political science, had just published an article in the journal Foreign Affairs under the title The Clash of Civilizations. That sounded interesting, so I made my way to the original article. With major conflict over political ideology now gone, I found Huntington arguing, the coming battles would be between the large-scale cultural blocks of the world. There were 7 or 8 civilizations in the world now. Western, Latin American, Slavic Orthodox, Islamic, Hindu, Confucian, Japanese, and African. About the civilizational status of Africa, Huntington was not really quite sure. But in any case, while states remained the major actors in the international order, the important thing about civilizations, in Huntington's view, was that they are very durable and that they tend again and again to determine who goes with whom in wider configurations of conflict. In Huntington's worst case, it would be the West against the Muslims and the Confucians. As he continued to develop his argument, it also became clear that his Clash of Civilizations thesis involved sort of large-scale identity politics, and that Huntington was a partisan in the domestic American culture wars of the period. Since it was important for the West to stick together, there could be no room for multiculturalism. Now, as you're probably aware, the Huntington thesis had drawn much attention and provoked considerable debate since then. But it was possible at the time, in the 1990s, to see it as one belonging with a number of other pronouncements about present and future states of the world. Even before Huntington, there had been Francis Fukuyama's remarkable suggestion that the world might have reached the end of history. One journalist, Robert Kaplan, already well known for his reporting on troubled regions, warned that the world was now facing a coming anarchy. And it was another foreign affairs writer for the New York Times, the columnist Thomas Friedman, who in a book on the transformative power of liberated and electronically empowered markets, who noted that his own book, together with the work of Huntington, Kaplan, and Fukuyama, could actually be seen as belonging in a genre. Friedman identified the genre as the one big thing. What happened was that after the end of the Cold War, people habituated for more than a generation to the metaphor of the Iron Curtain and the reality of the wall, could imagine their world anew. Indeed, asked with relief or anxiety what might happen next. And this small but lively intellectual industry had risen to the challenge, creating scenarios for a born-again world, suggesting what would be the coming big thing. Let's look at some of the resulting books. I think their covers tell some of the story. Here we have Samuel Huntington. Here we have Francis Fukuyama. Here is Robert Kaplan on Becoming Anarchy. Now this onrush of interpretive schemes may have slowed down a bit by the time the 1990s came to an end. But then there was 9/11 and another wave of global commentary. Here is one, Neil Ferguson's Colossus. Here is another, the same Tom Friedman again with a second book, The World is Flat. If the first wave had retrieved an old notion of civilizations to fit into a clash scenario, now empire was also back as a key word in a number of writings, at least frequently as a suggestive way of referring to the uniquely powerful position of the United States in the world order or disorder. And as another way of portraying the world again, Thomas Friedman, who had identified the one big thing genre some years earlier, continued his exploration of the global marketplace to proclaim that for reasons of commerce as well as technology, the world had become flat, by which he somehow meant that distances no longer mattered on a more level playing field. There was a lot about information technology and outsourcing in this book, and reporting from India. More recently yet, Friedman has had another immediate bestseller, bringing in the environmental and energy issues under the title Hot, Flat and Crowded. And then, if the crumbling of the Iron Curtain and 9/11 were points in time which marked the beginning of phases in the genre of world scenario writings, one may discern that yet another phase could be linked to the late 2008, as economic upheavals began on Wall Street and then spread rather unevenly over the world, making shifts in the global centers of gravity, mostly from west to east, to a degree from north to south, more conspicuous than they had been before. So this is the phase we're in now. Its early texts are already on the shelves, but more to come. My concern here is with this cluster of authors and texts which have converged over the past couple of decades on the task of offering new understandings of the world and of the near future of humanity. Writings like this may seem to be a somewhat odd preoccupation for an anthropologist, but then being now happily retired, perhaps I no longer run fast enough or hear well enough to be an ideal field worker any longer. And I also live in a world beyond worries over rapid research assessment exercises and the bibliometricness of academic audit society, so I can afford this kind of thing. What I aim at is a kind of overview of these writings and of their place in time and in the world. In part, this involves a scrutiny of the texts themselves, their assumptions, their handling of facts and concepts, their style. But at another level, I'm at least as interested in them as a kind of contemporary socio-cultural phenomenon, as a somewhat problematic component of an emergent global public consciousness and changing field of debate. I think of these writings as offering global scenarios, so let me first explain that term. I believe scenario fits in here because it refers to something rather inclusive, with people as actors in one way or other, and not least because a scenario points toward the future. Mostly, it's a relatively near future. These are 21st century scenarios. I'll come back to that time dimension in a moment. They are global scenarios, or world scenarios, because they attempt to offer the big picture of global conditions and affairs. There were times not so long ago when future scenarios may have referred to the world in a vague general sense, or to modernity, or what would come after it. But often they were implicitly inclined to be ethnocentrically Western. The scenarios of the more recent period are not necessarily free of such a bias, but at least they seem more often to involve a fairly explicit sense of the world as a single place, interconnected, but internally diverse. To some extent that may have been because they have been engaged, at least in that first one big thing phase, in mapping the way things would be after the Cold War, as that was indeed a confrontation, which manifestly drew in much of the world in one way or other. But then the shift is also a response to the way that globalization became a central understanding, a key concept in the last decade or so of the 20th century. Even if the term globalization has mostly been used so as to involve some regions much more than others, there is at least less of the utter disregard of other parts of the world which the West could get away with before. Now, what are these scenarios about? What characteristics of the future of the world do they try to describe? In a large part, they are certainly about politics, about international relations. One can hardly expect anything else as they respond to the end of the Cold War and to 9/11. They are also about the economy, especially the consequences of powerful market forces working across national boundaries. A bit remarkably, perhaps, this cluster of writings has mostly not been so much about environmental issues, but Thomas Friedman's hot, flat, and crowded marks a change here. What they're also about, to a degree, is culture. Several of the writers delineate the world or describe the parts of it and the developments with which they are most concerned, somehow in cultural terms. It's in this connection that I've also come to use the term geocultural, as in geocultural scenarios, or in the notion of the geocultural imagination. I draw here on the earthly sense of geo to make it refer to the distribution of things cultural, somehow cultural, over territories and their human populations. In different ways, this geocultural imagination acknowledges diversity in the world, whether it approves of it or not, whether it sees this diversity as threatened or threatening. But then the term also hints certainly at the connection between the geocultural and what we have long been referring to as the geopolitical. The engagement of at least some of the scenarios with culture very explicitly or somewhat implicitly, centrally or more fleetingly, is one reason why the scenarios should be of some particular interest to me as an anthropologist. Whatever anthropologists now think about the culture concept, and there has been some debate over that, it tends to signal issues we think about and talk about. When I first came across Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, I could find a certain pleasure as an anthropologist in seeing that a prominent international relations theorist had been retooling for an engagement with culture and cultural differences. I might insert here that Huntington passed away a couple of years ago. But unfortunately, Huntington's understanding of culture turned out to be of a kind that many anthropologists, myself included, were by this time busily criticizing and rejecting as essentialist. More precisely, in his view of civilizations as timeless, sharply bounded, and mostly hostile to one another, I saw a striking example of what has also been described as cultural fundamentalism. To summarize greatly, inspecting the uses of the culture concept in some of the scenario writings, an anthropologist may well be quite critical. Indeed, one could see the scenarios as a strategic site for debates over what to do with the culture concept in the public vocabulary and as an analytical term. More than once we can recognize a kind of rhetorical culture speak, where a notion of culture is employed in an expansive mode to suggest that some complex of ideas, values, or practices is pervasive, enduring, and rather fuzzy. What may be basically an argument about a distribution of power and conflict in the world, a geopolitical argument, is thus embedded in a claim that central issues and practices involved are very widely shared in a population, are inextricably linked to a lot of other ideas and practices, and have deep historical roots. There may also be a strong determinist implication that acting under the influence of their culture, people turn into robots. There is little room for reflection or agency. Such claims may not be spelled out particularly explicitly or examined with much critical commitment, but that may not make them less immediately effective. A bit more specifically, the geocultural dimension of the scenarios tends to involve attempts to change our maps of the world. They are about borders and about flows. Borders are sites of difference, of discontinuity in cultural distributions. I shouldn't perhaps go quite so fast here. Go back there. Right. Flows involve diffusion, redistributions, passages of culture in space, not least across borders. With this clash of civilizations thesis, Samuel Huntington thus wanted to draw new attention to some very old cultural borders, the fault lines between civilizations, where in his view conflicts develop again and again. But then some borders are rather more emergent, or may have evolved without everybody noticing, like those of Eurabia or Londonistan, countries or continents, which also figure, at least in the imagination of some of the writers involved, as scenes for a civilizational clash in the midst of Europe. At a time, too, when some saw a drifting apart of America and Europe, Robert Kagan, American political commentator, and another contributor to the genre, could dramatize the divide by borrowing from a title of popular psychology to suggest that Americans were now from Mars and Europeans from Venus. One might regard Robert Kaplan, who sees his coming anarchy in almost epidemiological terms, as in the sense of flow thinker. And for a prominent example of another variety of flow thinking, I would point to Joseph Nye, a Harvard political science professor like Samuel Huntington, and his numerous writings on soft power. Hard power, in Nye's terminology, is political power in a narrower sense, not least military power, as well as economic power. In large part, and in contrast, soft power involves culture, and what Nye is concerned with is primarily American soft power, the spread of American values. Nye sees these as projected in a multiplicity of ways, but not least through popular culture. In the post-9/11 period, in Nye's view, the American use of hard power had regrettably undermined American soft power. Perhaps Nye doesn't offer an explicit map of the world and its current divisions, but the German publicist Joseph Joffe, whom he quotes approvingly, concludes that American soft power at present, and I quote, rules over an empire on which the sun never sets. Now that certainly is a geocultural conception. Now, in a critical inspection of these writings as more or less scholarly texts, we can no doubt find faults both in overall understandings of culture and in use of borders and flows. In contrast with Huntington's conceptions of borders as fault lines, there is indeed another perspective which emphasizes, and I quote, the interflow of cultural materials between civilizations, as one of anthropology's ancestral figures, Alfred Kroger, put it more than a half-century ago. Since then, and so much research activity has focused on deterritorialization, virtuality, diasporas, world cities, hybridity, and creolization. A great deal more can now certainly be said about images of well-bounded clashing civilizations, as well as about overly homogenizing use of cultural flows within what is still often understood as a planet-wide McWorld, to use another term, out of the current scenario genre. So such scrutiny of the handling of facts and concepts is clearly a major part of a professional confrontation with the genre. Yet in their maneuvering with human ideas and practices in space and time, with a reinvention of old borders and striking invention of new ones, with finding cultural things out of their respective place, I think we sense a certain affinity between these recent scenarios and the past creations of George Orwell and Oliver Lubeck the Elder, and realize that to understand them more fully, we must try to grasp them in their locations somewhere in the borderlands between fact and fiction. The world in which Americans are from Mars and Europeans from Venus seems in its major divisions not entirely unlike that of Orwell's 1984, with its divide between Oceania and Eurasia. Not least we remind ourselves here of one central characteristic of these writings. They are, in no small part, about the future. Anything claiming to describe the future is necessarily fictional, even as it is argued that the claims are based on past and present facts. I would suggest that the scenarios are typically a genre in the subjunctive mode, a representation of hypothesis and possibility. Subjunctive forms involve what could be, what could come to be, what could have been, rather than what is, what will be, what has been. And this mode has its own range of cultural and textual forms. You may remember the anthropologist Victor Turner, who once wrote of his classic notion of liminality, particularly in ritual life, as subjunctive, a world of as if. In his scrutiny of varieties of news stories, the media scholar Michael Schudson describes something that he calls subjunctive reporting stories, which speak of what may happen if certain trends continue. Historians have their own noteworthy subjunctive specialty in counterfactual history, the analysis of what might have happened if something had first happened that did not actually happen, or if something had not happened that in fact happened. Now we can certainly see the subjunctive genres tend not to be a matter of pure fantasy. Scenarios are made plausible in large part through a more or less skillful handling of facts out of the past and the present, even when they begin as works of imagination, not really with a projection from what has gone before into what might come later, but already in the selection of what is to stand as relevant culture, current or historical reality. That is how we get the different one big things. Yet with the element of uncertainty and also freedom necessarily involved in what is subjunctive, it may be a good idea to pay some special attention also to other features of its genres, which can be employed to make works more persuasive, more worthy of attention. So from here on, I will look at the scenarios rather from one step further away, not so much as variously scholarly texts about culture, but rather as a contemporary cultural phenomenon in its own right. I propose that they've turned into significant components in a transnational collective consciousness, a set of representations of the world which are circulated, received, and debated in a world wide web of social relationships. I was perhaps first drawn to this kind of view toward the end of the 1990s, when I could find piles of the Huntington book on classic civilizations in bookstores not only in New York, but also in Frankfurt or Florence or Tokyo, in the original and in translation. The scenarios are not only about the world, but have themselves become a part of the global habitat of being. So as I said, Huntington had actually published his first article on civilization and conflict in 1993, and it met with such immediate interest that by the time he got to writing the preface to the book-length version of his argument, he could point out that in the wake of that first article, he had not only become involved in innumerable meetings with academic, government, and business groups across the United States, but had furthermore had the opportunity to participate in discussions of its thesis in, and I quote here, many other countries, including Argentina, Belgium, China, France, Germany, Great Britain, Korea, Japan, Luxembourg, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, South Africa, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and Taiwan. So clearly there has been a very considerable interest abroad in the clash of civilization scenario, judging from the list in just about all the civilizations that he had identified. By now, not only Huntington, but a number of the scenario authors seem to have taken this step into airport literature, the titles we find in the bookstores at London Heathrow or Stockholm Arlanda or Singapore Changi. And it's another sign of their prominence that when the journal Prospect made an attempt to list 100 leading global intellectuals, global public intellectuals in its October 2005 issue, it included 9 of the scenario writers I had by then identified, almost all the members of the central group. The selection may have been debatable in some number of ways, but it seems striking that almost 1/10 of the people held to have some kind of worldwide influence as thinkers turned out to be active in much the same genre. Why are these people to be held public intellectuals on a world stage? What do such public intellectuals do? Again, one central thing they do is that they talk about our common future. But one can do that in different ways. Keep in mind again that this is a subjective genre. In response to Huntington, the fear has sometimes been expressed that if enough people take this scenario seriously, it could turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yet the opposite is likewise possible. If scenarios credibly depict tendencies which we find unattractive and even dangerous, as they often do, we may do something about it, and then they become self-destructive prophecies. With regard to the question what this image making is for, we should hardly see it as actual forecasts, as attempts to really predict. We know that the human sciences tend not to do very well in predictive exercises. We would be better off viewing the scenarios rather as somewhat elaborate conversation pieces. While each of the scenario writers may have a particular agenda of his own, together their visions become instruments of debate and deliberation, form part of the self-monitoring of a reflexive society. But then one may wonder if the chances of the scenarios becoming self-fulfilling or self-destructing will not to a degree depend on who puts them forth. The kind of authors we have identified could possibly exercise some influence of their own. In the early cohort, several of them, Huntington, Kagan, Nye, Fukuyama, had served in Washington in one administration or other. Those who have not been so directly involved in government may at least have become accustomed to being read and listened to there. Rumor has it that President Clinton read Robert Kaplan's earlier book about ghosts, and that it played a fateful part, in the American reluctance to intervene in the early 1990s conflict in the dissolving Yugoslavia. And that Kaplan's more recent book, Imperial Grunts, about American soldiers deployed worldwide, became Christmas holiday reading in the White House for George W. Bush. Barack Obama has been observed taking Thomas Friedman's Hot, Flat and Crowded as summer reading to the beach. I think it's useful to try and push our understanding of the social organization and cultural production a bit further here, to see how the scenarios fit into the 21st century world. So let's give some thought first to who these people are who produce the scenarios left in the picture. All those, I think, show as major contributors to the genre are men, and one may wonder if women scenarists would have offered us something different. Apart from that, we have here a rather mixed group of authors, although not widely diverse. Political scientists, historians, diplomats, journalists. Mostly they are indeed American. One Japanese-American, Fukuyama, but the others Euro-American. A few are British, although they are then often transatlantic academic commuters, even with appointments on both sides of the ocean, like the historians Timothy Garton-Ash and Neil Ferguson. They may not always be easy to place on a right-left political scale, and occasionally someone may noticeably change position and company. But certainly some can be identified as more neoliberal, others neoconservative, perhaps someone as center or vaguely center-left. While some of these writers are university people and some are media people, one should also note the role of various kinds of think tanks in the intellectual and political landscape where scenarios are produced. It's probably fair to say that the circle of scenarists exhibit a degree of mutual awareness in a certain network density. Thomas Friedman showed such awareness at an early point when he identified the one big thing genre, but by now we hardly have to rely on his intuition or on my classification of the genre or identification of its membership. These commentators have continued to quite often refer to each other, comment on each other, review each other, debate with one another, occasionally interview one another, and write blurbs for the back covers of each other's books. This doesn't mean that their comments on each other's products are always friendly. After all, what they offer are often competing one big things. What's the typical public life of scenarios? Many commentators have pointed out that in a typical trajectory, a scenario first appears in a brief version in some more or less authoritative American journal of opinion. Foreign affairs, foreign policy, the national interest, the Atlantic market. Then, soon enough, the article grows into a book, which may or may not appear to add much to the first conceptualization. While articles grow into books, however, it's at least as important that, on the other hand, the original also frequently offers a message encapsulated in some even briefer formulation. Again, what above all enters the popular geocultural imagination are those seductive sound bites and catchphrases. The end of history, clash of civilizations, Americans are from Mars, Europeans are from Venus, the world is flat, soft power. Preferably, it seems, they should be unexpected, paradoxical, counterintuitive. History normally does not end. We do believe that the world is round. Both Europeans and Americans are Earthlings rather than from other planets. Real power is not so soft. Even the clash of civilizations may sound paradoxical, to the extent that we expect civilizations to be civilized. Or the key terms are a bit shocking, as they move from one syllable to the next, between the routine and the surprise. In those emergent regions of one continent, Eurabia, or London, Istan. It seems these books are really in the borderlands of academia, politics, and the marketplace. In part, we may want to see them as geocultural imagination in commodity form. Although the authors may be academics, they have published these books mostly with trade presses, not university presses. Perhaps we could think of the scenarios as a sort of hybrid genre, where academics can act like journalists, and where journalists are treated as gurus. But then again, the authors are also political animals with agendas, and reaching out through the marketplace need not be just a question of maximizing sales. The underlying assumption may indeed be that accessing a wider public now makes a political difference, and that this kind of writings is a worthwhile way of shaping opinion. This in itself is a matter of some debate. That is, are issues of foreign policy and international relations now really concerns of the wider public sphere, not something confined to a narrow circle of specialists with points of view likely to be inclined toward realpolitik. That's possibly more the case with regard to some issues than others, and more true also in some countries than others. It could entail a more general democratization of international politics, as some may claim, or it could rather involve a more varied set of particular interest groups, including diasporas. But in any case, if a wider audience can or is to be reached and influenced, ideas must be packaged right. So the scenarios as a hybrid genre also offer entertainment. Undoubtedly, however, it's in large part through the catchphrases, with some very variously clear and well-developed notion of what they may actually refer to, that the scenarios continue on their path from their authors' individual productions to the collective consciousness of wider publics. In between, moreover, they are also likely to pass through the news media, doing their off and on part as gatekeepers and interpreters. As you check the footnotes of the scenarios, you find that the empirical evidence is often from journalism, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, The Economist. But the traffic is not just one way. My early interest in the scenarios coincided in time with the study I was doing, mostly in the 1990s, of the work of news media foreign correspondents. And here I could note the interconnections between the scenarios and more regular forms of journalism, especially international coverage. About 10 years ago, I spent a morning with Bill Keller at the Manhattan headquarters of the New York Times. Keller was then the foreign editor of the paper, had made his name as correspondent in Moscow during the Perestroika, and in Johannesburg during the South African transition from apartheid, and is now the paper's executive editor. At the time, we talked about the strategic placing of foreign correspondents and what seemed likely to become important news sites. Keller mentioned that he had recently, for the first time, posted a correspondent in Istanbul. Turkey was an increasingly interesting meeting point between East and West, he said, although, and I quote him, you don't have to believe the stuff about the clash of civilizations. The point here is that foreign correspondents are inclined to find frames in which they can place events and give them coherence, what is sometimes called storylines. The narrative thread is thus simplified. One can slot each new event into the continuing larger story. These storylines are often regional. In my study, I could find storylines for Africa and for Japan and for the Middle East. But for several decades, the Cold War had been a global storyline. Unlike the regional themes, it could readily cross boundaries and move between continents. Like other storylines, It assimilated some events to itself, thereby perhaps transforming them, while it ignored others. When the Cold War was gone, the foreign correspondents and their editors faced more or less the same kind of challenge, which had provoked Huntington and Friedman and Kaplan and other scenario writers to look for the next one big thing. Yet even if, like Bill Keller, the New York Times editor, the journalists were not always in agreement with the one big thing stories, they entered in various ways into dialogue with them. Perhaps on the whole, the storylines of journalists and the book-length scenarios operate according to complementary logics. The storylines allow audiences to come back to the next installment in a series of sufficiently familiar products. The scenarios offer a more self-contained and complete vision of proclaimed change and discontinuity. But there also seem to be ways for one to turn into the other. When journalists grab for a scenario, especially in that short catchphrase form, as a way of getting a handle on an event, they at the same time serve as generous gatekeepers, swinging gates open to yet wider publics. The slogans and catchphrases make it into newspaper headlines and onto magazine covers, as in these cases. Despite the fact that the clash of civilization scenario has been heavily criticized and frequently rejected, it seems rather often becoming a substitute for the Cold War as a major storyline. It came up quickly and widely after 9/11, and a couple of years ago, again at least in the Scandinavian media, after the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten had commissioned a set of caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad, and crowds protested in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Pakistan, and elsewhere, burning an embassy in one city and a consulate in another, in a rather improbable jihad against Denmark. Even when commentators will go on to argue that no, this was not really a case of a clash of civilizations, and they don't like the notion anyway, it may be what remains stuck at the back of the distracted readers, listeners, or viewers' mind, that there is something called a clash of civilizations. And by then, as a collective representation, it has certainly moved beyond what could have been Samuel Huntington's control. Now let me return to what I said about Samuel Huntington's prefatory remark about the globally dispersed audiences for his view of clashing civilizations, to the listing of scenario writers as global public intellectuals, and to the presence of their work in airport bookstores all over the world. I haven't made much so far about the obvious fact that in very large part these scenarios and their authors are from the United States. A couple of years ago, a group of mostly American anthropologists published a critical volume titled "Why America's Top Pundits Are Wrong." Their book focused on some of the same thinkers I've been referring to here, Huntington, Friedman, Kaplan, together with certain other commentators on public concerns. They did concentrate on what they saw as errors in the punditry involved. What they didn't problematize was in what way it's really American. Certainly these particular authors are, and indeed the scenarios often show that they have been primarily intended for American readers. These have been stories that Americans tell themselves about themselves and their own place in the world. Even so, the rest of us do read them too, if only over the native shoulders. I'm interested here, consequently, in a double passage of concepts and conceptualizations, to a degree between academic and public discourse, but also within global society. Can the kind of scenarios we are looking at here and the intellectual exchanges over them contribute to the shaping of anything that we may describe as a cosmopolitan public sphere? What are the chances for a shared debate across national boundaries and intercontinental divides about the nature of the world, its past, present, and future, It is obvious that these exchanges are now quite uneven. Passages have mostly been from the United States outwards. The dominance of American scenarios can be seen as a case of what Joseph Nye in his contributions to the genre has described as soft power. These are indeed themselves examples of the cultural flow across borders. But as so often with such flow, some of the more interesting questions about them begin at these crossings, because the reception need not be entirely passive, smooth, and altogether predictable. Much of the time, certainly, what happens in the next step after the scenarios enter new intellectual and political narratives is not so clear to us, insofar as whatever there may be of interpretation, commentary, and critique proceeds in languages which we don't know. Occasionally, we may catch a glimpse of how through acts of intellectual brokerage, the scenarios pass into regional and national debates, and how in the latter debates they can get entangled with local arguments and divides. When I spent some time as an academic visitor in Tokyo a few years ago, I could learn a little about Japanese responses to certain of the geocultural scenarios. In particular circles, there had evidently been a measure of sympathy with Huntington's Clash of Civilizations argument because of his stance against multiculturalism at home. This resonated with their preferences for a homogeneous society in the Japanese context. But other views were more critical. In a country which had been involved in what Huntington might have seen as two major civilizational clashes, in the Russo-Japanese War 100 years ago, and in World War II, there were still those commentators who prefer to see civilizational encounters as culturally productive. By the time I was in Tokyo, however, the Huntington scenario was no longer so much in the news among Japanese academics or other commentators. Instead, it appeared that the notion of soft power was one with a certain appeal. And just as Huntington's critique of multiculturalism had to a degree been domesticated, one could discern that soft power could become made in Japan. The part played by popular culture was again central, as my Tokyo informants would note, that Japanese popular culture had recently diffused widely in the world, and hoped that this could be a goodwill resource for Japan in international politics as well. Nevertheless, Tokyo hopes for Japanese soft power seem to be only a Japanese recycling of what is still an American idea, still a matter of our audiences elsewhere in the world respond to American scenarios, rejecting them, accepting them, or turning them around. For the world to serve as a reflexive society together, it would seem we need more scenarios originating in different corners of the world. Or, if they are in fact already there, we simply need to find out about them. Clearly, the world system of language plays a part here. I'm struck again and again by the fact that language diversity remains a very effective obstacle to the global flow of knowledge and ideas, but more in some directions than in others. English is of course now the dominant world language, with many native speakers, but more importantly, much the largest number of speakers able to use it as a second language. Beyond English, the world as a space of intellectual activity remains remarkably opaque, not only to Anglophones, but to all others as well. Compared to all that gets said and written in one or the other of the languages of the world, translations remain scarce. Now, as far as the American origin scenarios are concerned, I certainly find readers the world over in the original English, but many of them are also translated sooner or later into some number of other languages. In that world system of language, however, there are few translations in the opposite direction, into English from other languages. Consequently, some of that geocultural imagination which flowers in other countries, other regions, other languages, may never make it into a more cosmopolitan arena. I learned, for example, from Russian colleagues of the debates which have revolved on and off for much of the 20th century and into the present, in Russia itself and in its diaspora, around geocultural and certainly geopolitical imagery of Eurasia. It's an imagery which emphasizes Russian historical and cultural linkages to Central Asia. Genghis Khan and the Mongols figure importantly here, and rather plays down its connections to Central and Western Europe. One might say that it shows some similarity to a clash of civilizations scenario, although it draws its boundaries differently. Yet it is a debate which has clearly taken place, mostly in Russian, and Huntington, like most other Anglophones, showed no awareness of it. With regard to the ritual languages, the catchphrase of one of our scenario writers is hardly correct. The world is not flat, not a level playing field, or at least that Tower of Babel, which is of course another construct of the geocultural imagination, rises above it. To try and speak back to the scenarios I've discussed, it seems one had better do so in the language which is most nearly shared, even if that to an extent entails accepting its built-in soft power. Yet perhaps it has been possible very recently to catch a glimpse of a shift in the loci of the geocultural imagination. Again, since the takeoff in the early 1990s, the global scenario genre has been largely Euro-American or mid-Atlantic, reflecting an existing political, economic, and cultural world order. But now that the world scene appears to be changing in significant ways from the first decade of the 21st century onward, it seems that there are beginnings of a new wave of scenarios. The author of the book Charm Offensive a few years ago, Joshua Korlachik, is another American who seems to move with ease between think tanks and the media. But the subtitle of his book again points to one geocultural shift. The subtitle is How China's Soft Power is Transforming the World. Again, the soft power concept has moved away from the Harvard scene, where it originated, and out of internal American debates over guns versus cultural flows. Moreover, we now see contributions to the scenario genre by writers from other backgrounds. Even in the relatively early period, some of the critical comments on these texts came from members of Asian and African intellectual diasporas in the West, from Edward Said, for example, or from Amartya Sen. Recently, we have seen prominent books as well by authors with somewhat different kinds of CVs. I can think of at least 3 such books from recent years. The Post-American World by Farid Zakaria, The Second World by Parag Khanna, and The New Asian Hemisphere by Kishore Mahbubani. All 3 were published in the United States by trade presses, and 2 of the authors are American-based, with characteristics not so unlike their Euro-American predecessors in the genre. Zakaria is a Harvard PhD, a former editor of the Journal of Foreign Affairs, and now a news magazine columnist, as well as a TV personality. So again, here is someone straddling academic and media worlds. And President Obama has been photographed with Zakaria's The Post-American World in his hand. Khanna's book had a conspicuous sort of trailer in the New York Times Sunday magazine before publication. He is based at a Washington think tank, reputedly offered opinion and advice to Obama's presidential campaign, and was somewhat surprisingly at the same time a PhD candidate at the London School of Economics. But Zakaria and Khanna are both born in India, one in Mumbai, the other in Kanpur. And then Mahbubani, of course, is Singapore's own contributor to this global conversation, a veteran diplomat as well as an academic here at this university. As it turns out, both Manubani and Zakaria, are also on that prospect list of global public intellectuals that I mentioned before. Recently, too, I found Zakaria interviewing Manubani on his weekly television program, Global Public Square, on CNN. So again, the network of scenarists seems to remain dense. Yet, these scenarists could bring rather different perspectives, competencies, and sensitivities to their scenario work than their predecessors did. So while these contributors to the shared geocultural imagination will hardly take the kind of liberties with facts or with maps that Orwell and Jihad did a few hundred years ago, it seems that again scenario production will be stimulated as people find that their places in the global landscape are changing. Thank you.